our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Hi, good evening, viewers. You're joining myself, Louise Marie, and I'm here with the wonderful educationalist and, frankly, powerhouse of PD, Professor Haili Hughes. How are you doing, Haili?
I'm fine, Louise, but I'm not feeling too much like a powerhouse after my 5:30 a.m. start this morning on my first day back in school after half term. But I'll take the compliments. That's fine.
Well, if I'm completely honest, just so kind of viewers are aware of how I met Haili. I met Haili in July at the Education Fest. And yeah, she was kind of one of the main reasons that I kind of wanted to grow my voice in the education space. So yeah, she has a very prominent voice, for those of you that don't already know, on lots of platforms. As I said, she is a PD powerhouse. She's been in this game for quite a while. She knows exactly what she's talking about. She's evidence informed. She is on the ground in schools and at trust level, and such an inspiration to me, and I know to many colleagues out there. So it's a real thrill to have you on, Haili.
That's so kind. Thank you so much, and hopefully what I'll say tonight will be interesting to a couple of people. But how do you follow the dulcet tones of Tom Rogers there in your intro is all I can say. So.
Okay, right. So our focus of today's talk is we're looking from weapons of teacher destruction to meaningful mass instruction. So we're looking at things like teacher retention, coaching, mentoring, and kind of looking at what Haili does currently on the ground, which is looking at how you implement CPD at a trust-wide scale. So Haili, if you want to kind of give us a bit of a background about your career and your current role.
Yeah, sure. So I've been a teacher for about 20 years. I was a late comer into the profession by a couple of years because I worked as a journalist, a national newspaper journalist at a newspaper in London that was closed down for phone hacking. So I won't mention the name of it, but I think we all know who we're talking about. And I never wanted to become a teacher. I wasn't interested, in all honesty. I used to think that teaching was something that people with English degrees did when they couldn't think of what else to do with them, or they were a failed writer or something like that. And I cringe at my own sort of thoughts now when I see how dedicated English teachers are. So I came out into teaching really as a necessity. In the early 2000s, applied for PGCE, spent some time in schools and absolutely loved it. But as so often happens with so many career changers who've worked in quite high pressure jobs and have those transferable skills, I fell into leadership very, very quickly, far too quickly, actually. And I became a second in English in my first year of teaching in quite a challenging school at the time, but in Warrington. Amazing school, though. My heart is still at that school, in all honesty. Like, I left, 15 years ago now or something, but I still love the school so much. It quickly went into special measures. I had a fantastic head of department, but she was quite old school. And once the school went into special measures, she disappeared and never came back, basically. So that left me in my second year, I think, of teaching as head of department in a special measures school. And it was a lot. It was a lot. I've written about this extensively, really. I was bullied by a toxic leader at the school, and it kind of drove me out, in all honesty, and I had to make that decision about my own mental health as to whether I was going to continue teaching after only 5 years, or if it was me, essentially, or it was the school, or I just wasn't suited to teaching. So I decided that I was going to give it another crack, and I moved to another school sort of 60 miles away from where I lived, and I brought all my family, and it was a whole change of lifestyle. We moved to the countryside, and I was at that school for over a decade and absolutely loved it. And I stepped down to be a classroom teacher. But what that enabled me to do is something that I think I'm really passionate about now, which is this idea of teach and, because I think there are so many teachers who have other interests, other passions, And I think sometimes our jobs become all encompassing, and what we can't do is pursue those other passions. And very often they're related to our job. Like, for example, I used to love to write, and, you know, I've written lots and lots of books now. But if I was a leader in a school, I would have had real difficulty in doing that alongside being a parent, etc. I love studying. I've done 3 master's degrees and a PhD, and I wouldn't have been able to do that alongside being a head or a deputy head. Lots of people do. You know, I'm thinking of people like Michael Charles, who just manages to spin time out of thin air. I can't do that. So stepping down to teach at that time was the right thing for me. I loved my job. I actually left school in 2021 after COVID. Like many people during COVID, I had time to kind of reassess what I wanted to do. I was given 2 incredible offers of a job, one by the University of Sunderland to be a lecturer and to run their mentoring provision across the whole School of Education, which was about 1,000 trainees at that point, so massive. And also as Director of Education at Iris Connect, a CPD provider. I agonised over whether to leave school because I loved my job and I loved the kids and I loved my subject and I loved my colleagues. But I was nearly 40, I think, at that point, and I just thought, do you know what? If I don't take this opportunity now, I might never get it again. And if I hate it, I can go back. And I didn't hate it. I had a really great time. I travelled the world. And, you know, I rubbed shoulders with people who up to then had been my education heroes, you know, the likes of Tom Sherrington, Mary Myatt, etc., became sort of, you know, colleagues of these people on the same bill as these people, which still blows my mind. But I missed school, probably from being a year out, to be honest with you. I missed it. And I reminded myself of those journalists, you know, who, like everybody else, is running away from the natural disaster and journalists are running towards it. And that was kind of like me with going back into teaching. I was seeing all these reports of teachers leaving the profession in droves. And here was me, like, desperately trying to run back into it. Yeah. So I completed my NPQH last year, and I had to make the decision then as to whether I wanted to go back in as a head teacher or as a trust leader. And I made the decision that at this point in my life, with a young child, with everything else that I've got going on, a professorship, etc., that I had to go and be a trust leader, just because of the flexibility that brings in terms of not to be in school at a certain time, not letting children down if you're out for the day doing X, Y, and Z. But I'm really lucky because the trust that I work in, I'm in one school 2 days a week. So I'm on the ground like any member of SLT in that school. I know the kids know me, the staff know me. So I'm still getting that kind of sense of purpose and sense of belonging from those 2 days full time, going in hundreds of lessons across 2 days, really getting a feel for practice in the school. And then the other 2 days I'm coaching senior leaders from all of our other schools from home, attending central team meetings. And one day I'm working as a professor academica. So it's a real gift, actually. And there should be more of this, because a lot of teachers complain that professors don't know the reality of being in schools, and that they, you know, spend a lot of money on research that actually doesn't have an impact in schools at all. So I think there should be more of this, actually. And there is in Europe. This is common to have professors who work in schools, and in Australia as well.
Lovely. Wow. I mean, this career is so impressive. Like you say, 3 masters, you've been on the ground, you've been at trust level, you've done your NPQH whilst having a family. Wow. Okay, lovely. Well, thank you so much for that. That sets a really lovely context for us to kind of lead into this discussion about PD. Let's kind of launch straight in, if you're good with that. So you've spent your career supporting teachers essentially from day one to leadership, and that's something you're really passionate about. What do you see? I know this is a difficult one. What do you see as the single most important factor that keeps teachers thriving long term?
I think agency. And I think it's a loaded term at the moment in education, agency, and there's this like misconception that agency just means teachers just being given carte blanche to do whatever they want to do. And of course, that's not good, because we're spending public money and teachers should be accountable, the same as all public servants. But what I mean when I talk about agency is what we might term as more like aligned agency. So it's this idea of like a really strong culture in a school that knows what the end goal is. It knows what it stands for. It's got that kind of really tangible moral feeling of the way we do things around here and that moral purpose. And teachers are aware of that, but they have the agency to deploy strategies and do the right things at the right time for the right reasons based on their personal competency, which is provided by professional development. So I think agency is a big part of that. And I think we've become too kind of obsessed with like the minutiae of techniques, I think, a lot in PD in school. And don't get me wrong, like techniques are massively important. We use walkthroughs as a trust and I found it transformational already. And we're at the start of our journey on that. But we have to make sure that those techniques that we're talking about in professional development and sort of implementing in classroom practice are also linked to like teacher identity as well, and kind of their current practice of what they do and why and how they do things, because that enactment piece of kind of making sure that it makes its way from a PD session to the classroom is all tied up in agency and professional identity as well. And I feel like we've moved a bit away from that. And I think probably part of that is to do with this obsession with kind of novices versus experts. And I think that's quite right for children. But I think for adults, we can be more novice at things, but also bring quite a lot of pre-existing mental models. You know, even our ECTs, they're not empty buckets that simply need filling up by experienced colleagues. So for me, that agency comes from like professional dialogue about decision making, really. And it's an interesting question that you've just asked, because Sam Gibbs and I have just written a book on teacher retention. We're just finishing it before Christmas. And unlike a lot of the other research that's come before, which has looked at the reasons and the factors affecting why people are leaving the profession or want to leave the profession, this book actually looks at the reason why people stay. So we've interviewed, it's not really been done before. So we've done interviews with teachers who've been teaching for 20 plus years in the profession. So we had some who were like 20 years, 25, 30, 40, and some of these were in the same school. Never left because all the things were in place. And we probably had like our own preconceptions about what we thought would be the main reasons why people stayed. They're the usual things: workload, work-life balance, you know, behaviour being good, routines, and all those things are massively, massively important. But actually, really interestingly, the number one reason, and I'm probably giving a spoiler alert for the book now, please buy it still, but one of the number one reasons why people stayed was belonging and feeling like they were making an impact, that tangible impact, being part of a community, being part of something bigger. And that's why people have always loved being a teacher. I used to love it, being part of like my community, you know, saying hello to parents, you know, all of that stuff, feeling like you're real part of the community and you're making a difference, not just to the kids in your school, but to your whole community. And teaching used to be a job that had like real status. And I feel like that status has just been eroded in the public eye. And it's almost like teaching kind of needs a PR boost, really.
Well, it's funny because my my whole family are teachers. All the women in my family, just by accident, we all just kind of fell in. It's an exciting conversation at Christmas when we go home. They're like, "How's teaching? Oh, you know, it's tough. Yeah. How's it for you?" But it's interesting because I came in 2009, and obviously 2010 we had our new government and things changed. And my mum was telling me she'd been teaching for 15 years, 20 years before that. Oh, Louise, it was vastly different. And I'm like, well, tell me about it. What's happened? And she was like, well, teachers were respected. They did have more autonomy. They were asked their views on things. They were treated as experts and professionals. I mean, don't get me wrong, there was still a high level of accountability, but things have been different. But it's interesting to hear your experience, because obviously you've been in education longer than I have. I'm only coming into my 17th year.
Only a few years longer, to be fair. Only a few years longer. So, 4 years longer. So,
yeah. Oh, well, I need to catch up with you in terms of you've done so much. Yeah, it's so inspiring. So thank you for sharing that. But it's interesting. It's always really difficult to know where the line is with agency and accountability, especially as what we're touching on today in this show. When you're looking at PD at scale, I mean, you said you mentioned like 11 schools in your trust. How on earth do you, in your opinion, in your experience, create a level of consistency, but still allow for that level of school agency or even departmental or subject agency, because that's really hard to find that balance? How would you suggest that schools and trusts kind of approach that issue? God,
I mean, I'm still learning. I'm 6 months in. And And I've learned from lots of other amazing work that's going on at other trusts. So, you know, I have to give a shout out here really to people like Louise Hughes from Chiltern, who've been so generous with their time. Chiltern are massive compared to my trust. You know, colleagues at Oasis, colleagues at Astraea who've met with me and taught me through what they're doing, United Learning colleagues. So this is the thing about trust, and this is what we were kind of saying before we came onto here. Trusts get this like bad rep in the press. From people about being, they're so top down and they're run by fat cats and all of this. Like, you can't tar all trusts with the same brush. And what they don't see is the professional generosity that goes on at trusts, where people are giving up the time to share things across the sector. You know, another classic example is Windsor Academy Trust. Their CEO, Dawn Haywood, they run a big conference every couple of years, and she invites loads of people from across the sector to come and learn together as colleagues. This sort of stuff is like bread and butter. But in response to your kind of your initial question, I think the way I can only talk you through the way that I've started to do this, and this is like a 3 to 5 year endeavour, right? This isn't like, here's Haili, she's going to come in and we're all going to do this now. That's just not the way it works. And especially half of my schools are primary, roughly half are secondary. I'm not a primary practitioner. I've had to go in with a real vulnerability and humbleness into those primaries and to learn from those experts in their context. And actually, I'm doing that in secondaries as well, because I'm swooping in, getting this snapshot of what's going on when I come in. And actually, I'm not the expert in that context. So I'm coming in to listen, to learn, to have that professional dialogue with leaders. So the way that I went about it was I spent the first probably 6 to 7 to 8 weeks in all the schools, observing lessons, doing walk rounds, talking to staff, talking to kids, talking to the leaders. And what I wanted to do is get a really clear idea of what the persistent problems were in these schools and trusts, in our trust overall. So in each of the schools, and then did like a big cross section of kind of the overlapping persistent problems. Now, a lot of our schools are in really disadvantaged areas of Liverpool, in Merseyside, St Helens, etc., Sefton. And a lot of those persistent problems overlapped. We would expect that, right? But there's nuances for each of the schools, because they're a different school, different makeup, different kids, different locality. So when I've mapped these persistent problems, I started to look at some evidence about what would be the best evidence-based ways to tackle some of these persistent problems in terms of teaching and learning. So I use things like a Great Teaching Toolkit, all of the work that we know about cognitive science. I've relied heavily on quite a lot of the work that my colleague Carl Hendrick and Jim Heel and Paul Kirshner have done at Academica. And then what I did was I had to make a decision then as to how we were going to approach this. And my whole job this year is building and trying to implement a shared mental model of what great teaching looks like in our trust. So it's based on the persistent problems. To do that, I've come up with 9 overarching lesson principles. And these are not steps in a lesson. It's not, I need to come into a lesson and see all of these things in action. That's not the way we've done it. These are overarching lesson principles. And they're things like running a room, activating hard thinking, checking for understanding, high participation. None of these are like things that anybody would say should not be in a lesson. You can't argue with them. They're based on evidence. They're based on our persistent problems and what we need to do, what's going to be the highest leverage thing we can do to really boost progress, and get all kids thinking hard and doing things with that knowledge. So that's been kind of my work. Sitting alongside that kind of 1-page lesson principles is an instructional playbook that I've produced. Now, some people who are listening might go, what the hell is an instructional playbook? It's quite American. Trusts and schools have kind of cracked onto these in the last couple of years, but they've been doing them in America for years, basically because of Jim Knight's work on instructional coaching over there. So this instructional playbook is, if you like, a teaching and learning manual for the whole trust, and it takes each of the lesson principles and essentially it breaks them down into what this lesson principle is, why we employ it, moving on from the learning model, and we use the diagram that Oliver Caviglioli did based on Dan Williams' work. So, why do we do this? What's the point of it? Because that why is massively important to teachers. Unless teachers understand the why, they can't do the other stuff. Then we look at the how. And as part of that, we look at possible lethal mutations of this in action. So, for example, when we're looking at cold calling, we might look at a lethal mutation of that as being asking saying a student's name before you cold call, not giving enough wait time. I mean, there's all sorts of kind of problematic things that might happen there. And then after this misconception, each of these lesson principles has then got a walkthroughs cluster. We decided to go with walkthroughs as a trust because it does allow that level of agency where school leaders can decide on which walkthrough cluster is best to tackle their persistent problems that they've identified from QA. And obviously you can click on these walkthrough clusters. It will take you to the 5 steps. It will take you to videos, all the great stuff that's on that platform. So that's been sort of my life's work over the last 6 months at the trust. And now it's at implementation stage. So now we're at the stage where we've got this real kind of robust implementation where middle leaders who are the, for me, as Adam Robbins says, are the engine room of school improvement. Middle leaders are in lessons all week. They're then reporting back to senior leaders about what are the bottlenecks, what are the problems, what have they seen, and then the senior leaders can be responsive and plan intentional and explicit CPD based on tackling those problems. I coach the senior leaders responsible for teaching and learning in each school every fortnight, and they bring those problems to me, and then I go and spend a day in each school every half term, walking around lessons, talking to leaders, but it's a really supportive kind of tiered process. So we've gone for the approach of alignment with agency. So we're all aligned around a shared mental model of what great teaching and learning looks like. And then we've got the agency of school leaders who are the experts in their context, choosing what their persistent problem or learning problem is in their school that they need to tackle, choosing the highest leverage walkthrough strategy, and then implementing that with PD over the half term. Alongside that, I've also done PD principles. So I noticed that the quality of professional development across the trust was not consistent. So I have come up with kind of what all great PD should have, and it's based on the EF's PD mechanisms and the EF's implementation model as well. And what we know about adult learning and mental models and professional dialogue, challenging conversations as well, and feedback. So yeah, we're at the start of this implementation journey, and I've absolutely stood on the shoulders of giants with others. But I am very much of the mind that we need to harness internal expertise and build internal capacity for PD rather than constantly spending thousands on programs, consultants, etc. All of those have their place. But for me, the joy of working in a MAT is that you've got all of that internal capacity to develop, and it's just more sustainable, especially with a financial situation as well that schools find themselves in.
Nice. Do you know what I find really interesting, actually, because I think different schools and those that are in trusts take different approaches to PD, obviously quite rightly. But it's interesting how yours follows a method. Like you've gone in, you've been on the ground, you've identified persistent problems, and obviously in a trust with different schools, at different ages. You mentioned obviously secondary and primary, secondary being more your specialism and your experience, but actually identifying those persistent problems, thinking about mental models, but actually not being prescriptive with what you think should be in every lesson. It's like you've drawn together colleagues from these persistent problems, heads of department, teachers on the ground, and you've said, okay, what are the issues? Like you said, what are the bottlenecks? What does great teaching look like? Let's create this playbook together. So I can see where this agency is coming in, because it's starting from the get-go. It's not we've identified the problems without you, and therefore we've created this playbook, and now we're going to be prescriptive of what we want to see in your lessons. Hods, can you check this is happening? We want to see a do now. It needs to be this length. We want learning objectives. We want this. There must be exam practice in every lesson. Your plenary must always have mini whiteboards. Actually, you've created a playbook on principles, which has therefore enabled staff to then take it to their department or their subject with their colleagues and their expertise and say, this principle we've got to stick to because we are aligned with that culture and that's embedded and we believe in it and that moral purpose. But this is how we're going to tackle it. And like you say, it then ties in really well to your walkthroughs. And so I think that's interesting. And I think that's something that schools and maybe other trusts can start to reflect upon. Are we maybe being too prescriptive? And at what point are we stripping teacher agency? And how is that impacting our retention in school?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think we do need to be prescriptive about some stuff, right? So, like, you know, once the school has identified that, say, for example, a school has identified that pace and students and high participation is one of their bottlenecks, it's one of their problems, and it's resulted in students kind of, you know, sitting back and opting out, if you like, for a lot of the lesson time. Say they've identified that, and let's say they then tell me, so over this half term at least, if not longer, because obviously we can't implement things in like 6 weeks nice blocks or 7 week blocks, over at least this first half term and maybe longer, we're going to actually focus on 3 checking for understanding techniques to increase pace, to increase participation. They might be think, pair, share, show me boards, cold calling. Once they've decided on those 3 things, that's non-negotiable then. So colleagues need explicit training in those. They need to know the 5 steps of those. They need to be having those conversations within their departments or phases about how those steps might need to be adapted to link into their own practice at the moment, or subject specific stuff. So you asked about subject specificity and phase specificity. I can never say that word before. And we're doing a lot of work on that using the walkthroughs adapt framework as well. So this idea that actually, you know, this new learning has got to stick to a teacher's old habits. It's that habit stacking idea, hasn't it? Of like, okay, well, I already do this with cold calling. So how do I need to adapt my practice based on these 5 steps? What's different? Why is it different? You know, how am I going to use that to teach Romeo and Juliet tomorrow with year 9? And it's that intentional, Astrea call it intellectual planning, you know, and I think that's really important, that intentionality in teaching. So once they've decided on those walkthrough techniques, there's no agency then. The only agency is like how you deploy them or when you deploy them, and you use your teacher expertise for that. But we will expect to see those strategies employed. So teachers can't like pick and choose, I'm just not going to do those. That you know, there's no agency there. But the agency is on when they use them, how and why, and then that's what those coaching conversations need to be about. So it's almost that like visibility and mapping of mental models, of teachers' mental models.
Nice. Lovely. I'm going to come to coaching in a second, so I know that's something you're really passionate about, Haili. But this is a good time to say this show is brought to you in partnership with #Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So if you can log on, we occasionally give out discount codes as well. So feel free to go to the Teachers Talk page and see what you can get from there. Okay, Haili, so it sounds like the conversation, I think, is kind of moving into that instructional coaching. We've looked at principles and playbooks and persistent problems and alignment and culture building. So imagine we've kind of, obviously culture is something that we continue to build. Talking about your thoughts on instructional coaching, I think a lot of schools are kind of getting on that bandwagon, and I don't mean that in a superficial way, with good reason. Tell me kind of how you do that on such a large scale across your trust, and what kind of training needs to take place.
Well, at the moment, we are not doing instructional coaching across the trust. We have some schools within the trust that use StepLab, for example, for instructional coaching. We will move towards an instructional coaching model, but it probably won't be like a sort of pre-bought-in platform. Sarah Cottinghat, Adam Colbeck and I have just written a book on coaching that's to do with decision-making and mental models and professional dialogue. So we will probably be using that. But I think what is needed when it's at scale is consistent training of coaches. So, you know, there's been loads of research done on what makes a great coach or what makes a great instructional coach. And it's not necessarily just being a really great teacher or a really great leader. I mean, it obviously helps if you're a great teacher, because part of your role as an instructional coach is to model things to the person that you're coaching. But actually, there's a huge, massive, wide-ranging skill set that instructional coaches need. And they need kind of really thorough and quite explicit training on that, with like scenarios and things like that. I think that's the first thing. We need training, but we also need time. We need a really robust conception of what our version of instructional coaching looks like, because there are many. I mean, you only have to go onto Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, and type in instructional coaching in the search bar, and you will find like pages and pages of arguments between professors and people running instructional coaching platforms and teachers and leaders telling you that's not instructional coaching, this isn't instructional coaching, and you can get caught up in the weeds of like definitions of what coaching is. But I think the sort of definition of instructional coaching for me is a coach working together with another teacher in partnership. And by the way, in partnership doesn't mean that there's no kind of telling or advice. Sometimes that's needed because you can sit and rub somebody's back for hours and they won't get to where you need them to get to. And we haven't got that time or luxury in schools. So it's two teachers or a teacher and a leader working together in partnership to help that teacher get better in a certain area of their practice. And that's what instructional coaching is. We don't need these highfalutin arguments about definitions. So we haven't done it across the trust yet. We are planning to, but it's going to be a staged, phased approach. I think it's easier in some respects if you do buy in a platform. I know StepLab have brilliant training that they have for coaches. There are other platforms like Iris Connect who do this stuff as well. Lots of other coaching platforms out there. Or some people use a model. Some people use Jim Knight's Impact Cycle, and that works for them. But you've got to build something where there's a real clarity about this is what instructional coaching means in our trust, and this is how we do it. And coaches need training on that as well.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so I'm going to take this, if it's okay with you, I'm going to take this in a slightly more international direction. So you've mentioned before how professors in Europe will be kind of on the ground teaching as well as obviously still doing their research, still lecturing. How is PD different in the UK to the rest of Europe? And kind of what are the pros of how they maybe do it over there or potential pitfalls?
I mean, I guess the sort of straightforward answer to this is I'm not 100% sure, in all honesty. I can't speak for kind of the whole of Europe. I know that my university is based in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam. It's an applied University of Applied Science, which basically means that it's much more connected to like the professions than it would be in other universities, traditional universities, where kind of academics are quite separate really from the professions. So it's almost more like a PGCE in terms of like, very often you'll see people running PGCs who are education academics, but they're not traditional education academics. They've been school teachers and have come in to train teachers now. So they've got that kind of on the ground experience. So I certainly know that my university, Academica, does a fantastic program called High Performing Schools in the Netherlands, which is very similar PD to what we have here. It's based on this idea of kind of going in and observing what's going on, focusing on persistent problems, schools working with one another who were more high performing and kind of almost coaching them and training them through things and sort of real evidence-based and practical, sort of bridging that knowing doing gap. I think in America, there's lots that I've seen of bad practice in PD, in all honesty, where, a lot of kind of what the teacher's doing doesn't seem relevant to their classrooms at all. It's kind of an administrator coming in and kind of talking at teachers, very similar to what it used to be here, and dare I say it still is in some schools. But, there are really great things going on in the US as well around the science of learning, like Meg Lee in her old district, Frederick, they're hitting the news a lot in the US at the moment because the science of learning wave is really kind of riding quite high. Same in Australia. So I would say that we've really kind of led the charge, I would say, in terms of that real evidence base for professional development of those mechanisms for the EF, of having that conception and that mental model of actually this is what great PD looks like. Because I think prior to that, we were all just kind of bubbling along doing the same thing. Let's get a consultant and it can come and do a one and done, and then we'll go away and hope it implements into classroom. That was certainly my experience for at least 15 years of my career. And I had really great intentions about going to this conference and doing this looking at this CPD and going away and making reams of notes, and I was going to do this and I was going to do that, and then it just kind of never happened because I fell back into old habits. So I think people like Peps McRae, who's really looked into kind of the science of expertise and motivation, and people like Deans for Impact with deliberate practice. I think that has really made PD in this country like much more impactful. And I would say that from what I've seen, apart from some really pockets of great practice, the rest of the world are quite far behind in terms of that. And I'm probably going to get shot for that comment, but that's been my experience anyway.
No, but it's really interesting because obviously I've only ever taught in the UK, and I've got some friends that are teaching in like the UAE and in Australia. So I get snippets, but obviously I don't hear it necessarily about a PD level or a kind of like SLT level. So I think it's quite interesting for colleagues that are kind of tuning on or playing back to kind of get that experience that obviously you have and kind of that insight. I mean, I didn't know that we were particularly leading the way, so that's interesting. I mean, I sense it on LinkedIn when you go onto the platforms, like on X. I'm not on X, but on LinkedIn and stuff, we're talking about conversations. I mean, you see posts coming up daily by Carl Hendrick, you see Peps McRae. There's really prominent bloggers coming up with some great academic research. I mean, you yourself are regularly posting particular, poignant academic journal articles and highlighting teachers towards it. So it's implied we know we're good at this stuff. But when you haven't really left the UK in the industry, you don't necessarily know. So it's reassuring to know we're kind of on the cusp of that, really. Which kind of leads me to the next question. This is a really big question. I think it's going to be difficult to answer. So prepare yourself for this. No pressure. Are there any particular pieces of research you would say, let's make this easier, this year that have really altered how you've thought about PD?
Yeah, a very recent report by Teacher Development Trust about adult learning, didagogy, they're calling it, has really made me sort of think about, are we actually infantilizing teachers? Are we deprofessionalizing them? So yeah, I found that really interesting, and I'm going to be sort of digesting that properly over the next few weeks and thinking about what that means for us in our trust. Also the research that Church of England did reasonably recently on flourishing, and again this has become a buzzword in education. What does flourishing even mean, and belonging and psychological safety. So I think that's made a real impact. And also some of the stuff that's been coming through about like the MPQ reviews as well, and how the MPQs are really fantastic, really evidence-based. I assess them, I deliver them. I've got a lot of stake in the MPQs. I've just finished my MPQH. But at the same time, it does miss out quite a lot of that like relational aspect of being a leader. Like nobody teaches you how to have those really challenging conversations with staff. And I find as a leader, that takes up like 95% of my time. Nobody's ever kind of asked me about that paper Rob Coe wrote in 2014 or, whatever else I've done on my MPQ. And that's not to say that wasn't a great paper. If you're listening, Rob, it is. But it's those soft skills that are absolutely not soft skills, actually, that I think we as leaders need more training on. So yeah, that they've had a real impact on me kind of recently, and also the Teaching Commission's paper on teacher retention as well, which I was lucky enough to be a commissioner and to write the early career departures bit of that, and it really made me sort of reflect actually on what it is that we need to practically do in schools, because lots of policy people and companies, trusts, etc., write these kind of policy papers, but actually it often points out to leaders like that we're not doing enough. But actually, we're on our knees. Come and tell us what we can do. Give us some recommendations. And I think the Teaching Commission paper does that really, really well. It doesn't just point out problems, because we could all tell you them. You could bung us a tenner and we could tell you the reasons why people are leaving. But it's that practical kind of, here is some practical stuff that actually school leaders can do, but actually policy, government, etc. can do. So that really kind of impacted on the way I see our biggest asset in schools, which is people, and how we keep them.
That's really interesting. What are, this again, maybe slightly controversial here, what are your recommendations? So if you said you've worked on it, you're kind of working with, working on policies and suggestions for how we're improving education. What would yours be?
Oh, I think the accountability that is on schools and leaders now is just insane, basically. And I feel like schools have become like the fourth emergency service, 100%. And the pressure that is on leaders at the moment goes far beyond pressures that have ever been on school leaders before. Even when I started in the profession like 20 years ago, your sort of role as a school leader has always been tough. It's always been challenging, but it was mostly to, keep kids safe and help them learn stuff. Yeah. And now it's like, feeding them, helping the families financially, it's all of that stuff. And I think it's really, really tough for school leaders at the moment. And like the finance problem, I've seen today that, the government is saying that schools are going to have to fund their own teacher pay rises, and schools are already like absolutely cut to the bone, and I just don't know how we're going to do that. So yeah, I think the accountability has got to change, but in order for that to happen, we've got to take away like this marketisation of education, where it's like schools pitted against one another like businesses. And I think it's Johnny Utley from Teal Trust who talks about the fact that, you know, as trust and school leaders, we have like you know, kind of a servant leadership, civic responsibility, not just to want the kids in our schools or trust to do well, to actually want all the kids in Hull to do well, or all the kids in Warrington, or all the kids in Oldham to do well. And we need to take away the competition that this has brought from that, because a lot of that filters down into head teachers. I also think the SEND crisis, I mean, we could talk about that all day, and you could talk about with people who know a lot more about it than I do, that's for sure. But I do think that, you know, children aren't having their needs met, and schools can't do much more than they're doing. And you can sense the frustration of parents, the frustration of leaders, you know, the poor children who are at the centre of this, and the system seems quite broken. So I think if we could do work on SEND, I know we've got a white paper coming on that, which has been put back, I believe, till January now. We've got a new Ofsted framework which centres everything through the lens of vulnerable students, be that SEND, EAL, pupil premium, etc. But actually, how are schools going to meet these demands? There needs to be something put in place in terms of capacity, finances, training, something, because there are so many schools that have been outstanding for years and years and years, and I fear that when this new framework comes out, they're going to have a shock, because it seems almost impossible for schools to do well at this. And as I say, leaders are on the knees and capacity is stretched so thinly, and you know, we need some help and some support.
Just so for anyone who hasn't had a chance to kind of have a look at that new Ofsted framework, what is it about the framework that you think is not achievable?
I'm not saying it's not achievable. Let me say that now, because there will be loads of schools that come out great in it. But in tough schools, like I work in, where so many of our students have SEND or a pupil premium, I'm not sure how we're going to have the capacity to meet all the needs that we need to meet. So it is achievable 100%, but it's going to be tough in some schools for some contexts. So it's things like, we already put loads of stuff in place in terms of scaffolds with students with special educational needs. We already do all of that stuff. We already, you know, have strategies for our pupil premium students of how we're going to help make sure that they have a quality, you know, with other students who aren't disadvantaged. But it seems like it's like a different step up from that. And, you know, the sector is tired and we're all working really hard, and yeah, it's just going to be really tough, I think, in the toughest schools, and it's always tough for the toughest schools. I mean, Phil Naylor wrote a brilliant book called Some Schools Are Tougher Than Others or Harder Than Others, and they are, I'm sorry, and it's going to be really tough for those schools.
Okay. Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's interesting, actually. I want to come back to that point you made about marketisation of schools, which is, I mean, it's something I teach quite a lot about. When you talk about, like, it's quite a new right American idea originally. And obviously we then took it in the UK, and it was the idea that we'd be pitching schools against each other, and it would drive up, this competition would drive up standards. But it's always felt at odds with what education should actually really be about. Like, heart is in collaboration and support, and we are here for the kids, and we're here for the families of those kids, and obviously we're here for each other as in teams. So that pitting against just seems inherently really uncomfortable, and it always has. But that's the education system that I've always worked in, and I think that's where it's interesting to kind of talk to people that've been in it longer, because obviously when we're kind of making schools academies and converting and all that jazz, it then automatically becomes like a business, and we're all like pitting for funding with results, and we kind of lose sight a little bit of why we're actually really here. I mean, I don't say that lightly. Many schools don't, of course. Most of us don't. But it's difficult when you've got those external accountability pressures, like, oh, my progress 8, my attainment 8, am I hitting those? Am I hitting my quota of students? And it's like, what about the students we already have? Are they actually, like you say, are we meeting their SEND needs? And it sounds like a couple of the things that the government are suggesting at the moment are interesting. So, for example, bringing teachers into kind of assessing SEND for students. Are we trained for that? Like, where's the training for that? Where's the budget? Where's the capacity? I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all need to just wait and look and see what this white paper says now, because there's so much like conjecture and rumor, and it's just stressing people out and causing a load of like gossip, and we don't even know what's going to be in this white paper properly yet. It's all kind of leaks and rumors, etc. And when we know what's in it, obviously we can hope that the support is going to be put in place in schools to be able to help them meet those new requirements. And I'm optimistic still. Some people might call me mad, but I'm optimistic that we've got people like Tom Rees, for example, who really knows his stuff, and he's on the ground as a trust CEO, of a very, very big trust, who's kind of one of the people at the helm of this white paper. So I'm trying to stay optimistic, but I would hope that anything that is put in place in terms of requirements is really considered of how schools are going to get that support to be able to meet those needs.
Yeah. Interesting. I think you're right. You raise a really important point there about conjecture, and it's really difficult, isn't it, not to get caught up in it on educational platforms or professional platforms, because we're all discussing it, and before you know it, we're all panicking, and then you're like, you've got a piece of information that I haven't had. Where's that coming in from? What we're going to do with it? How we're going to deal with it? And you're quite right, it hasn't been published, so we probably just need to kind of wait and kind of be a bit more patient with it, and then pull together when we need to.
Yeah, and I mean, this happens all. So I was just going to say, this happens all the time, to be honest, in education, and I think it's obviously become worse with social media, because people can sort of publish things that they're thinking and have heard, and it goes out to like millions of people. And this happened during COVID all the time, because nobody really knew what was going on. It was like, the school next door has told us that we're going to close. This school has told us this, and there was so much rumor, and it was causing so much stress for school leaders and for teachers, that I just think, we need to be careful, and we can all guess what's going to be in this white paper, but we don't know.
Interesting. Okay, so if I'm going to roll this back, I've kind of jumped between questions, apologies, because I got so excited between some of them, but if we're talking about accountability, I think that kind of ties in somewhat to impact. So we've talked about how you would, or how you are implementing CPD across your trust at 11 different schools. We've compared it to kind of different schools in Europe and around the world, and how we're leading that. How do you actually measure impact of effective CPD?
Yeah, so at the moment, we're at the start of our journey. Our impact is being measured from what's going on in classrooms. So it's that classroom application, because if CPD doesn't pass that knowing, doing gap and into classroom practice and into the habits and routines and norms of teachers, then there was no point in doing it, essentially. So our kind of measuring of impact happens on a weekly basis, where we've got heads of departments going into lessons, looking at the implementation of the strategies that we're focusing on as a school. How are those being implemented? Are the teachers doing the right things at the right time for the right reasons? How do they know? Is this resulting in pupil progress? Are all the pupils thinking hard? Are all the pupils learning? Are all the pupils doing things with that knowledge? And then I go in as well, SLT walk round. So that impact is being measured on the ground in classrooms. It's also being measured by the sorts of conversations and professional dialogue that's being made, because my aim at the moment, right, is to have a shared mental model of what effective teaching and learning looks like, and to be deploying that ourselves in our classrooms. So I want to hear the kind of professional curiosity and dialogue about, what does this look like in English? What does it look in EYFS? And we've sort of changed a lot of line management meetings, for example, to be really solely based on conversations and dialogue about teaching and learning, because that's going to make the biggest impact. Instead of like, I'm going to use this line management meeting to tell you about like a trip I'm running next week, or, I need a bit of budget to do this, or because that is not like strategic, it's operational. And although we need those operational meetings, it could have been an email. So that precious time that we've got together needs to be spent on that professional dialogue about teaching and learning, and for us to be kind of moving forward. So we're very much measuring impact by what we see, boots on the ground in classrooms. We can't measure impact on results at the moment, because we only started implementing this in September, after a period of sort of 2 months of me coming up with our plan and looking at the persistent problems. We only had like one assessment point since then, so the real results and the proof of the pudding will be in August, when we get our results. However, and there's been a lot of talk about this on Twitter in the last few weeks as well, about like receipts of school improvement. Rome wasn't built overnight, and even the EF say it can take 3 to 5 years to implement something. So to expect like instant results is just not realistic in a lot of people's context. It might be in some others, but it might not be in ours, and progress might be slower. So we would expect to see some gains in results, but are we going to go from like, for example, a negative progress 8 to like a positive of 2? No, and that's wild to think that that's going to happen. But actually, are we going in the right direction? And you measure that by what's going on in classrooms, and the results come as a result of that.
That's interesting. I kind of want to come back to that point you've mentioned about how you have kind of guiding line management. How do you do that in a way that isn't bordering micromanagement?
Yeah, so I think it's by having a real focus of the senior leader who's meeting the curriculum leader on listening. So they're asking them a probing question and they're listening. And you know, the questions guide the middle leader to reflect on what's going on and what the big picture is in their department, and you know, where our pupils are, and especially our key pupils in terms of kind of, you know, interventions they might need, or progress, or help and support. But it's about that senior leader listening, and that is a skill in itself, and using questions to guide the reflection. But actually being humble and sitting back and listening to that middle leader as an expert in their subject. And again, that does not mean that you can't be directive, because you sometimes have to be, but it is going in, listening. That's the key. And that's the difference between that kind of micromanaging top down, you will do this, as opposed to, this is my idea, let me listen to what you think. Right, okay, let's come up with a shared mental model together.
I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of school-wide or even trust-wide structured line management meetings? So you've talked about the whole idea is that your line manager will be asking meaningful questions, and it's more about active listening and encouraging that professional discourse. What are your thoughts on actually having it planned out throughout the year? So for example, this will be a discussion on a data drop. This will be a discussion on how you're moderating or standardizing a set of PPEs. And it's that kind of level of scripting. Or do you think it should be a case where your line manager has more autonomy and can ask the questions that they want to ask?
I have no opinion on it, in all honesty, because I think that trusts will do what and schools will do what they need to do to make progress. So I'm not going to sit here and slag off things that other trusts are doing. That's not what I'm about. What I would say is that the way that we've chosen to do it is that, and this is not across the trust, by the way, this is the school that I'm working in 2 days a week that is in Measures at the moment. The way that we've chosen to do it is that we have a standing agenda for line management meetings where we privilege the discussion of progress of particular key students. So again, looking through that lens of our most vulnerable students. And then the second line management agenda is the implementation of the walkthrough strategy that we're all working on at the moment, and what the bottlenecks are to that, what are the persistent problems, where do staff need more training on that, so we can intervene. And then the other agenda items are for decision, between the kind of SLT link and the head of department. So we've got kind of 2 standard agenda items which are privileged, and then the others can be decided. So we've gone from kind of, again, an aligned agency position, aligned autonomy. But, you know, if some trusts do a really kind of rigid line management structure, good for them. That must work for them. And, you know, I don't know what the context of those trusts are. So I've always been somebody who has never, ever commented on what other trusts are doing, because it's not my business. And I'm sure that whatever decisions those leaders have made in those trusts, it's the right ones for that trust.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, like you're talking about context and trusting professionals as experts in their own context, because I think we can get lost in this idea of reading a piece of research and being like, oh, well, it's worked in this school, it's worked in this trust, it's automatic, this is how we should be doing PD in our school and our trust. But you're quite right, actually, we should be trusting those kind of at those levels, still asking the questions, still holding people to account and having that professional discourse, but saying we can't automatically take that research just because it's happened somewhere else and be like, this is what we need to do. There does need to be that conversation of that embedded CPD.
Well, that's where you get your mutations when you do that. That's where you get your lethal mutations. So if somebody just kind of, you know, goes, all right, well, the school down the road has done this, it's totally different context from mine, we're just going to pick it up. And we sometimes see that when senior leaders move schools, they bring all their old policies, etc., from their old school and just shoehorn them in, and it very rarely works.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm aware that we're coming close to time, and we've discussed so many things. So thank you so much. I imagine that viewers and listeners back have taken a lot from this. I know I have. What would be your one piece of advice that you would say either not to do or to do when it comes to implementing PD at scale?
So what to do and what not to do?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing to do is to work from the idea of building a shared mental model. That's what I would start with. So this idea of actually where is the practice now? Where are the persistent problems? So focus on persistent problems. That's going to be your thing to do, and then building a shared mental model on how we tackle those persistent problems. So that's to do. Not to do, I think, is to just think that if you're going to buy something in that's the shiny thing, that's going to be the end to all of your problems, and that, you know, if we just buy this thing in, this program, this consultant, you know, this package, whatever, we're sorted, completed it, mate, bought the t-shirt. That's not the case, and then it's that implementation that follows, which is the key.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. As I said, we've had a lot of insights and heard from a lot of your experience, which is wonderful. If colleagues would like to reach out to you, where do you suggest and how do they do that?
Probably not Twitter /X /Elon Musk's hellhole, whatever we're calling it now, because I very, very rarely go on. Tom Rogers will probably edit that out, but no, I rarely go on there anymore. I mean, I will go on if someone tags me in it, so LinkedIn is probably the best place, to be honest. You can find me on there, Professor Haili Hughes. I also have a Substack, which I was prolific on a couple of months ago, but just with, like, I don't know, doing the actual job in schools. I've just had no time to think, to be honest. I used to live like, you know, the kind of thinking lifestyle when I was at Iris Connect and at Sunderland, where I'd wake up in the morning, have a coffee, read a research paper, you know, do this, and have
the dream.
Honestly, I have this time to like pontificate and beard scratch, and now I'm actually doing the job again. I'm just like, save me. So I will be substacking again very soon. And I also run a podcast called Sitting in the Chair, which is all about the reality of headship. Again, I've been woefully terrible at uploading my next batch of those, but they will be coming before Christmas. And I have several books due out as well in the next 6 months. One of them about coaching.
How many books are you at now at this point?
Oh, I think I've written like 7, 8. I don't know. I think 4 are out. 4, I think. And then I've written one with Adam Colbeck and Sarah Cottinghat on coaching with decision-making mental models, which I think has got the power to be really transformative in schools. It's practical, it's evidence-based. I've written a book with Miriam Hussein on ready to teach and inspect calls. So English teachers all over the world are feverishly waiting for this book. I think it's been in like the top 10 bestsellers for like a year. So, because there's no books on an inspect calls. So
my sister will want that one. Yeah.
And it is really good. I do actually think it's the best book I've ever written. It's 150,000 words, twice the size of my PhD thesis. And then I've written a book with Sam Gibbs on teacher attention, writing one with Michael Childs on leadership, with our own kind of leadership framework based around head, heart and hands. And then I've written a book with Stuart Pryke on knowledge hacks for English teachers. So yeah, a lot. And a mentoring book for English teachers for Crown House. So yeah, loads. I never want to sign a book contract again. In all honesty,
no, because we love your voice. Like we
I'm tired. I'm tired.
No, it's time for rest. I mean, you've only got 7 weeks until Christmas. Yeah, I imagine you're probably going to work through that, aren't you? I mean,
no, I don't actually. I'm really strict on that. So I had to do a couple of mornings work during this half term to deputise for a deputy head who was poorly at the school I'm working at. But actually, I really do draw the line in the sand for that. And same at weekends as well. That is sacrosanct. It's family time. And I did that when I was a teacher and a leader in school as well.
Well, I think that's healthy, and I think probably I could learn from that. So, well, thank you so much for your time, Haili, and thank you very much, viewers, for tuning in. As I said, we've got Haili. Reach out on LinkedIn, invest in her work. It's fantastic. She's written numerous books. Reach out and PD, coaching, anything that you think that she can help with. She's very, very supportive. And I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for Haili with regards to kind of getting my voice out there and getting some ideas. So thank you so much, listeners. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time where I will be hosting a show with Joanne Crofts around command words and science. So please tune in. Excellent. So thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are